we'll jump into our presentation. So thank you for coming tonight. Here are our two speakers. Our moderator is Jill Huff, who is our museum curator here at the Pioneer Museum. And then our speaker tonight is Dr. Paul V. Dutton. He is a professor at Northern Arizona University, and Jill will give you a more thorough introduction in a moment. I just wanted to share a couple other things. If you don't know, we are the Arizona Historical Society, and we were established by an act of the first territorial legislature on November 7th, 1864. So we're the oldest historical agency in Arizona, and you can see our locations across the state there on the map. This is our mission. We are connecting people through the power of Arizona's history. If you haven't seen it yet, this is our brand new license plate through the state of Arizona. So you can order this monsoon design and get it on your car if you are looking for a new plate. Two of our museums are currently open in Tucson and Tempe. So they have limited hours still due to COVID, but they are open if you want to visit in person, or we're doing a bunch of these talks online if you want to visit virtually. These are our two big exhibits at those two locations. So down in Tucson, we have Barry Goldwater's ham radio out right now. It's pretty impressive to see, very large, fills the room. And then in Tempe, our Still Marching exhibit that talks about women's protests throughout the years and women's history, perfect for Women's History Month. These are our next upcoming talks if you want to register and come to them. The next one next week on the 17th is Women in Aerospace, and this is actually the Smithsonian putting on this talk. We're an affiliate, so they let us know and give us some special access to their talks. And then our next one after that will be Wednesday, March 24th, Never Alone. And that is an interview with Jimmy June Wong, whose family lived here in Flagstaff early on and owned this American Laundry that you see. He was son of an immigrant woman who we talked about in our resilience exhibit, Do You Wong. So he's going to talk about his mom and growing up in Flagstaff. And then after that, we've got a cool talk, The Objects We Leave Behind. So our registrar is going to talk about collecting objects and what it means and show off some of our collections. Oops.
What are you barking at? Stop it.
And then if you're not a member, you can, oh, I skipped a slide, sorry. Sorry, I skipped like 3 slides. Here we go. If you're not a member, you can join and you get these discounts and access to our Journal of Arizona History, which gets mailed to you quarterly if you're a member. So some perks there. And the journals are now available on Project Muse, which is kind of exciting. You can read them digitally since, of course, they take up a lot of shelf space. So if you're looking for other events, check us out on azhs.org, our website. And you can see, you can register for other events or just see what's coming up. And we have a blog where we do blog posts about history. So check out the website, azhs.org. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand this over to Jill. Just a quick reminder, please do mute yourself and keep your video off for the presentation part because Dr. Dutton's going to share his screen, so he won't be able to see you. Put questions in the chat if you have them, and then at the end you can unmute and share your video if you'd like to ask questions. So thanks so much for coming. Here's Jill.
Thanks, everybody. This is an exciting evening. I think here in Flagstaff, we're supposed to get 3 inches of snow, which is perfect, right? Which is it's actually a perfect lead-in for this presentation, because I think a lot of Sun Cityans were headed to the Phoenix area in the early 1960s to get away from that snow, right? So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, which is Dr. Paul Dutton. He's a historian of health and social policy. He holds the positions of Professor of History and Adjunct Professor of Health Sciences at Northern Arizona University. He just published his third book through Cornell Press, University Press. It's called Beyond Medicine, Why European Social Democracies Enjoy Better Health Outcomes Than the United States. That's pretty exciting. It just came out, what, Paul, in the last month, maybe?
April 15.
Oh, it hasn't come out yet.
Yeah.
I went on the Cornell University Press website to see, and I guess I didn't put one in the cart, but anyway, it's coming out here next month. Super exciting about that. Between 2008 and 2015, Dr. Dutton founded and directed the Northern Arizona University Interdisciplinary Health Policy Institute. He's organized public educational events and has conducted the Colton House Health Policy Roundtables in collaboration with the Arizona Board of Regents. Dr. Dutton's op-eds have appeared in the Boston Globe, the International Herald Tribune, and the New York Times. He's held research fellowships at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the American Philosophical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Brookings Institution, and he was a Fulbright Fellowship in France. Thank you, Dr. Dutton. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jill. That was a very generous introduction there. And I just want to thank the Society for inviting me, and especially you, Jill, for getting me involved in this presentation. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in and share my screen and get started here. And that's my first image. Of course, the title of the talk here is From Sanatoriums to Sun City, the Creation of Active Retirement in Arizona. And I'll talk a lot about what I mean by active retirement here. And I have an image that shows up again, a couple images that show up again later in the show. So you'll see those. So let me go to the, whoops, I went too fast, didn't I? Yeah, that is my next slide. Sorry about that. So I just want to mention at the outset that this talk is based on an article that I published in Le Mouvement Social back in 2017. And these are really the primary questions that I want to deal with tonight. It's a rather long article, so I'm not going to be able to present everything, but I'm going to do my best to cover most of it. And it's probably, I'm going to shoot for talking for around 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And then we'll get a chance to have questions and comments. And I'm really curious about what you all have to say and the questions you might have. So my questions are, why did the Sun City phenomenon originate in Arizona? And I'll define what I mean by Sun City phenomenon in a sec. And then secondly, how has Sun City's creation of active retirement living affected our notions of aging and death? So there is a kind of a philosophical side to this, especially towards the end, and talking about how it is that this phenomenon that I'll call the Sun City really took place. I want to give a short shout out to Flannery Burke's recent article in the Journal of Arizona History. It's really good. And she deals with especially the sort of the spatial, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic divides that came about in the building of Sun City and the populating of it. And it's also something that's in my article, but I chose for this talk to emphasize other factors rather than those. We can talk about those, but I really want to refer you to her article, and that's in the, Jill can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm quite sure it's the winter issue of the Journal of Arizona History, and it's really quite good. So I highly recommend that. So let's move on here to my first image. And when I say the Sun City phenomenon, this is what I'm talking about. So here we have the Village Retraite Espoir Soleil, which is, of course, in France. And you'll notice in these aerial photographs that, whoa, looks like something was copied from someplace else. And I'll tell you, the French copied Del Webb. The French copied Sun City. In fact, there's some 80-some Sun City type restricted age retirement communities in Arizona alone, some of them with populations of 30, 40,000. And Sun City, of course, the original Sun City itself was 20,000 acres, 45,000 at total build out. And now there's Sun City West. There's all sorts of Sun Cities, really not only just across the United States, but all over the world. So that's what I mean by the Sun City phenomenon. It's really worth studying because they were certain creations there in terms of planning and the way in which they sold it as an active retirement living that I think has changed. You will see this as part of my argument, changed the way in which we think about the third age, that is after retirement and before death, and really notions of how we think about death themselves. So that's really what I mean by the Sun City phenomenon. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to my first example here, because my argument is also not only has Sun City really changed how we think about retirement and how we live retirement, or many people live retirement, but also death. But the origins of it, you really can't understand it unless you go back into the late 19th century. And so there really are two migrations, and I'm going to be expanding on both of them here. And we'll spend the first part of the presentation talking about the what I call the health seeker migration. And it's not something that I named, but it's a common term for those who were coming to the desert Southwest and other dry locations in the West to seek respite and cure for respiratory ailments, especially tuberculosis. And that's why I have these two images here before you. One is a booster logo from the city of Tucson. Tucson was central, especially early on. Phoenix follows suit, as does Flagstaff in a smaller way, to attract health seekers of all kinds. And I'll talk a lot more about that as we go forward. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, I have the cover of the 1960 Sun City sales brochure. And below, and I'm going to ask for you to do a little thought time to yourself here, and if somebody wants to throw out an answer in the chat, because it's a question for you here. I've got two quotations on the top, sort of in orange. The dry, clear atmosphere and the sunshine every day make the climate salubrious in the extreme. The second is, every day is blessed with a full measure of clear, invigorating air. Now, one of those quotes comes from a tuberculosis sanatorium. The other one comes from Sun City sales brochure. Which is which? Anybody want to take a guess? Do we have any answers? I think that Sasha or Jill said that they were gonna. There is a little bit of a hint. If you look closely, I wouldn't ask you just to guess straight away. So there is a little tiny hint as to which is which here. I'll pause here for a second, and I don't know.
I've got to guess that every day is from the Sanatorium.
Actually, it's the other way around. It's the Sanatorium is the dry, clear atmosphere. And the only little hint, and I don't know if it's enough, is the term salubrious was much more commonly used. That is, helpful is the translation there of a synonym, was much more common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that's why I don't know that the Del Webb may not have put salubrious in his sales brochure, but in any case, we have this, the point is made here is that these were two different but very comparable and linked kinds of migrations. The first being the health seeker migration, and the second is, of course, the migration of retirees to Arizona beginning in 1960. And I should say that, you know, we think about Arizona now as a retirement location, but before 1960, it wasn't. There was one other small retirement community, formal age-restricted retirement community, which I'll mention later in a bit when we get into this. But Del Webb, who was the founder of the Del Webb Development Company and the builder of Sun City, really did make Arizona almost single-handedly into the retirement destination that it became. So let me move on and talk about how it is that this got started. And what I'm really saying here is that both of these migrations had to do with the pursuit of health and the evasion of death. And both of them are linked to industrialization, and they're linked to each other, as I've said. So what do I mean by when I say they're both have their origins in industrialization? Well, if you think about tuberculosis, and of course I could talk probably much more than we have time for today about that, but up until the early and even into the middle of the 19th century, tuberculosis was often viewed as a romantic way to die. Of course, it's a pulmonary disease, although it can attack other organs in the body. It becomes quite chronic. Some people can live 10, 12, 20 years with tuberculosis, and it's an ailment that they have to deal with on a daily basis, but it doesn't kill them as quickly. And it also has a long list, and I've got them there listed on the right-hand side, and that's just a small list: Balzac, Bronte, and Emily, Camus, Chekhov, Keats, Lawrence, Maupassant, Molière. I mean, these were all great artists and writers who died of tuberculosis, and there even became this mythology, of course, as to, was it genetic in some way? Was it the disease of genius? And this was often the way it was thought about. And sometimes people could come to be proud of that they had tuberculosis and they were going to die this romantic death, just like John Lewis Stevenson or Henry David Thoreau. And so this is part of the understanding of tuberculosis in the early 19th century. And it's, of course, before germ theory. Germ theory, of course, comes in the late 1880s, 1890s, with better microscopy and the ability to understand and see bacteria, because it is a disease that's caused by bacteria, as I said before, usually in the lungs. So that, of course, changes with industrialization. As the cities in the United States grow, and throughout Europe as well, any areas that are industrializing, the textile factories, the chemical works, the steel mining, steel manufacturing and mining, these were places with particulate in the air, noxious fumes, dangerous conditions, especially to the lungs. In other words, these industrial working conditions literally made people sick. And one of the principal ways that they made people sick was through pulmonary disease of all kinds. And not only did the workplace make people sick in the cities, so did where they lived. I mean, I think these tenement houses are well known to, I'm sure, to many of in the audience. If you are interested in this talk, you're a history buff at some level or another. This image on the bottom right, of course, is a bunkhouse for textile workers. And you see, there's 5 people in this photo here. So what I'm trying to say here is it wasn't just the working conditions that made people sick, it was where they lived as well. I mean, you had ambient air quality declined in the cities, and people were especially hard hit. The working class was especially hard hit, but so was everyone because of the increased dust and noxious fumes and pollutions in the air. Now, I just wanted to say that so the tuberculosis moves from being sort of a romantic disease to just plain deadly. And I mean that in 2 ways here, because it became associated, of course, with the urban working class, which was threatening to the middle and upper classes in the United States. And also because of the increased concentrations in living environments and in working environments, transmission increased. So we had a real epidemic in this country and in Europe in the 19th century that killed way more than most people usually realize today. Of course, you can see there at the bottom, 1/3 of the deaths of those 18 to 25 years old, really a radical increase in the tuberculosis deaths. And my next image here shows the how it compares, because I just threw this in here, and I have a chart here for tuberculosis, and there's the bad guy up there, the tuberculosis bacterium. And you can see with the chart on the upper left that the case mortality rate for per 100,000 in the population, and it's really very high. And sometimes I figure, well, this is an audience, and virtually everybody, we all fall in this category now, of thinking about case mortality rates because we're currently living through a pandemic. So what I did was I pulled off this chart on the lower right, is of the COVID-19 case mortality rates. And just because we are just about at 1 year right now, approximately, of the existence of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have, and then of course the chart on the upper left is done annually as well, you can see that the numbers here are really much higher for tuberculosis. The mortality rate, the worst case, of course, is in the Czech Republic, and it's running at 208, if you can see that. I can barely see it, sorry, per 100,000, and then the UK is the next country down at 188. But look at the TB, it's up over 300 for many years in the 19th century. And then of course it falls in the course of the 19th century. And that's to a great degree because of better housing, better food, better what we call in the health sciences, the improved social determinants of health. But we don't get the flat out bang cure of it till we get antibiotics in the mid 1940s. And that really ends the tuberculosis pandemic in the United States. So this is something that I just wanted to have you understand, is how serious this disease was, and it wasn't well diagnosed. I mean, physicians tended to lump all respiratory ailments, because again, they didn't have microscopes and they hadn't identified the bacterium at the time. Tuberculosis, asthma, silicosis, which is usually an occupational disease, emphysema, lung cancer even, all under this term consumption or phthisis. The only cure that was identified, and it was quite effective, was the climactic cure. So now we return to thinking about Arizona and the dry desert Southwest. But it wasn't just the Arizonans who had discovered it, or Westerners. The Germans were out in front on this. They had been building sanatoriums for quite some time in the 19th century, and they had a 60% survival rate in their sanatoriums in Germany. And I have another image of a sanatorium also in Germany just for children. And of course, the Germans were doing this, and at the same time, the French were arguing about whether they should build sanatoriums. That's a whole other interesting story that I won't get into here, was what was going on in Europe and the methods of dealing with tuberculosis. But in any case, we also are getting reports in the United States from out west, and specifically from Arizona. And this is a quote from a US Army surgeon, and I'll read it out. I hazard nothing in saying that a more healthful and healing climate for those laboring under the great destroyer, phthisis, could be desired. These cases seldom present themselves, and then only among immigrants, that is, those who have come from the East. I am now staying here for about 2 years and have not had a death among the troops during that period. Evidence that good health is our epidemic. U.S. Army Surgeon John Clark. And this comes in the 1870s. I don't have my notes, I'm not looking at my notes at the moment, but that's, coming from Fort Apache, which is the reason why I use this image behind it. So people are getting these reports about the promise of a climactic cure potential out west, especially in Arizona. And it's in 1880 that Arizona gets the railroad. The Southern Pacific Railroad arrives in Tucson in 1880. And I had to include the Pecos Viaduct, which of course is in Texas, but it was critical to the completion of the Southern Pacific at the highest bridge at the time, and arrives in Tucson. So now we have this gateway that's able to bring those who receive these terrible kinds of diagnoses from the Midwestern urban industrial cities, ways in which they could come out west because literally their life depended on it. And they come to a place where there is a vast array of places of facilities, let's put it that way, that they can seek this climactic cure. Many of them, of course, don't have much money, but for those who do, they can take advantage of some very nice sanatoriums. I should say, though, before I get into the actual sanatoriums, that these peoples, which we'll call health seekers, this migration of health seekers, they're participating in a cultural movement. And those of you who can remember the great quote from Horace Greeley, who was a newspaper editor at the time, "Go west, young man, go west." Usually the second part, which was most important for us here, is cut off. There is health in the country, my emphasis. There is health in the country and room away from our idlers and imbeciles. So this was very much not just a last ditch effort, but the idea that you went out west to seek better health was very commonly held. So the idea that if the only way in which to survive tuberculosis for a family member, then going out west was the thing to do. Theodore Roosevelt, the president of the United States in the early 1900s, and John Muir were both advocates of roughing it in the West as both good for the country and for people's health. And so we have both sides of those of you who are familiar with the foundation. John Muir, of course, is really the founder of the Sierra Club, a leading preservationist at the time. And Theodore Roosevelt, of course, created many national parks out in the West. And this image taken, I'm quite sure, from Glacier Point in Yosemite, overlooking Yosemite Valley. It's certainly Yosemite Valley, but I'm quite sure it's like Glacier Point. But my point here is that this was part of a cultural movement as well. It wasn't just a medical migration. And John Muir, in fact, brought one of his daughters, Helen, to Arizona, to the Mojave Desert, not the Sonoran, for a cure that was successful. And so we have the destination, and as I mentioned before, I got ahead of myself a little bit, but this was if you could afford it, this is where you wanted to go. This is the Desert Sanatorium in Tucson, which was built in 1920. And 120 beds, 30 clinical and research staff, 800 square foot solarium for heliotherapy, the largest in the world at the time. Quartz glass, by the way, 800 square feet of quartz glass over the top of this thing. The domes are made of copper. And this was the premier place to go if you could afford it. Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health and the medical school at Hopkins were closely involved in advising and staffing the Desert Sanatorium, which became known as the SAN. And you can see the images on the bottom there of a typical, what we would call a sanatorium room. And then, of course, this image on the right, on the bottom with oxygen, the ability for the patient to receive oxygen. So this was where the celebrities and the well-to-do could come and seek the climactic cure in Tucson. Now, if you couldn't afford that, there were 21 other sanatoriums in Tucson by 1930, and I have a advertisement for one, the Whitewall Hospital and Sanatorium up on the top. And then, of course, there was Tedville, which is where, these were for the folks who got the diagnosis of tuberculosis, and all they could afford was a one-way train ticket. They were out to save their lives. And so they ended up in Tucson. And this is an area, Tedville, if those of you who know Tucson a lot, my son lives on East Lee Street, which is an east-west avenue in Tucson, just north of Speedway. And Tedville was located to the north of east of Lee Street, west and east Lee Street, up toward and all the way up toward Fort Lowell. So this is a place, many of these tents, this is actually a pretty nice one has a wood floor, obviously. Some of these tents did not have wood floors, and you can imagine what the conditions would be like in the summer. But this again these people were quite desperate, and the mortality rates were very, very high. Phoenix wasn't outside of this, of course. Phoenix had Sunny Slope. And the reason why I call it Sunny Slope, Phoenix, but it really, now those of you who are in the Phoenix metro area, you may know of Sunny Slope, where it is, but Sunny Slope originally wasn't part of Phoenix. The Phoenix city government wouldn't allow tents in the city as they would in Tucson. And so there was a group of about 600 health seekers who made their way north of the city and started the settlement of Sunny Slope on the sides of these mountains that was very sunny, and so they called it Sunny Slope. And now it's a community all of its own. There's a Sunny Slope High School and the whole deal. But really, if you think about what happened, these sanatoriums, they were the basis for the healthcare infrastructure in Arizona. And I'll start on the top right here. John C. Lincoln, which I think now is Honor Health. John C. Lincoln Hospital was a sanatorium built on Sunny Slope back in the 1920s, and now it became John C. Lincoln Hospital. St. Luke's, Good Sam, the Tucson Medical Center, of course, are both, there are images of the Tucson Medical Center on both sides, the left side of your screen there. And of course, the front is on the bottom left, but on the top left is the Tucson Medical Center, where they've actually saved a piece of the Desert Sanatorium behind the medical center. So my point here is that this Desert Sanatorium became the Tucson Medical Center. In 1947, I believe, it was sold to the city of Tucson, and TMC came into being, formerly the Desert Sanatorium. So what are we waiting for here? Where we're waiting for Arizona's most important health seeker, at least in the context of this talk, and that's Delbert E. Webb. Del Webb actually comes from Los Angeles in the early 1920s. He's a carpenter. He suffered not from tuberculosis or some other pulmonary disease, but from typhoid. And his weight dropped to about 99 pounds, so it's written. And he made his way to find his health in the dry climate of Phoenix. And he works his way, this story is well known, and I'll just summarize it. He begins a small building company, first building grocery stores, then homes, and then he moves into government contracts in a large way, especially during the Second World War. And this image I have here, creating berths for the intercontinental ballistic missiles, that's of course later, that's contemporaneous with the building of Sun City. However, I put it in there because I just wanted to give you a sense that Del Webb, of course, became a substantial military contractor, building air bases, airfields, barracks, training facilities for the United States Army and the U.S., what was known as the United States Army Air Force at the time. And of course, some of you recognize the fellow on the left, bottom left, Howard Hughes, who also was a defense contractor, an aircraft manufacturer. Webb and Hughes were good friends, and they collaborated in building facilities oftentimes. And then there's the image in the center on the bottom, which is the Del Webb Development Company, which he starts, which is the corporation that builds Sun City. So there is Webb in the center of this, and we end up with Webb observing what's going on in Arizona in the 1950s, as well as what's going on out in Florida. And of course, Webb, as I mentioned before, is already building houses, and he notices that there's this little 700 home community that's built outside of Phoenix called Youngtown, still there. And that is a facility that was built by a man named Schliefer, who decided that he wanted to build a community that wasn't like, that was for retirees, there was age restrictions, but it wasn't a nursing home. And it was a place in which people could kind of do what they want and not be bothered by pesky nurses and things like that. But it was a bare bones operation. But he did build it 700 homes, and it did build out at around 1,400 residents. Out in Florida, they're building, of course, retirement communities. Now we're in the, of course, post-Second World War period. And Florida was common, as you might guess, because it was the closest warm place to the large industrial metropolitan areas in the East and Midwest, New York, Cleveland, Boston, et cetera. And so, but what Webb notices as well is that there's other factors at play. And so this makes him more interested than ever. And I just want to come back to one of my themes here to remind you that both of these movements, this health seeker movement of the late 19th and early 20th century of people seeking a climactic cure for their pulmonary disease, tied to industrialization because that's how they got sick, is also going to enter in here because we have the creation through industrialization of what is known as the ternary life cycle. That is this idea of your life goes from birth and childhood and adolescence to work and then retirement. That really is something new that is a social creation really of the first order here. Because if you think about the agricultural societies that preceded the industrial and commercial societies that we now live in agricultural society, there was no point at which, 65, now I stop working in the fields. That's not how it worked. You worked in the fields to the extent that you still could. Family took care of you if they could, et cetera. Now we have this idea in the commercial and industrial enterprises of where the owners of those enterprises want to disemploy the older workers because they can no longer keep up. And in fact, the unions are helpful to that because they want to bring in the new workers to replace the older workers if they can, to employ their own young union workers. And of course, the solution to that is what? Pensions, whether they're private company pensions or whether they are, as shown in the image in the center of this screen, the Social Security Act of 1935, which we're all thankful for now. And then, of course, this is more the image on the bottom right adds to that ability of people to retire in 1965, which is just about the time at the moment that Sun City is being built, the Lyndon Johnson signing the Medicare and Medicaid law in that year of 1965. So these are things that Webb is observing, and he's looking at the fact, he's tracking the demographics of this, and that he understands that by the 1960s, Americans were becoming richer. Older Americans were becoming richer faster than the younger age cohorts. And I have this image here on the bottom right to sort of illustrate that, to give you a sense that the country is aging at this point, and also the senior citizens, and that's not a term, we get that term in the 1930s, senior citizens are becoming a larger proportion of the US population. So this brings us to the aspect I'm always trying to look at, where, sort of comparing cultural movement to cultural movement. If we had the cultural movement of the health seeker movement driven by people like Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir, and the idea of the climactic cure of going west to get healthier and become more prosperous as well, we also have a post-Second World War period where the idea of outdoor activities could also improve your health. And you'll notice here that many of them were low impact. So they really were quite appropriate for retirees to pursue. And of course, whether it's swimming or archery, camping would fall into this category, bowling, I think that guy was president, became quite popular during the late 50s and 1960s, all at the moment in which Webb is considering building something called Sun City. So we get to this moment as well, where not only is it possible for people to live longer because they're in better health and they're wealthier, they have the health insurance is coming into play with Medicare, but also it makes, it's more possible to live distant from children. And always the contrast that I want to draw here between the previous agricultural society and the industrial societies, the industrial and commercial societies that preceded it. So the television is part of that story because you could attend events, quite literally, sports events, cultural events, opera. You could see events happening on the other side of the country without having to work to be there, and that was an effect. On the right there, the image on the upper right is the building of the interstate freeway system, which made people feel that they could travel more easily, and they could. The image on the lower left, of course, is air transport became far more accessible to people to fly from one side of the country as well. And the thing about it is that if you were coming from a Midwestern city of Minneapolis, for example, the idea that you wanted to age in place near your children, that could be attractive to folks in the 1950s. However, as you get into the 1960s, many of those children, of course, start to migrate themselves out to the West. My own father, in fact, migrated from Iowa to Silicon Valley as a young engineer. So the idea that he was separated, of course, his family and my mother I grew up in California. The idea here is that the country everybody was migrating. And so why shouldn't the retirees who had more money now do the same? The bottom image on the bottom right, of course, has to do with, as you can see, what's in the back of the trucks there, air conditioning. We had the creation of what are known as swamp coolers, right? And as well as air conditioning units, which made living in the Sonoran Desert year-round far more comfortable. And so Webb took advantage of that. I should say at this point, it's no coincidence that in 1957, the Federal Housing Authority, which guaranteed many of the mortgages in Sun City and elsewhere in Arizona, made the decision to allow the inclusion of central air conditioning in the mortgage. Previously, if you wanted central air conditioning, you had to buy it yourself, essentially, and then you could get a mortgage on the rest of the house. But in 57, that changed so that you could get a mortgage that included the central air conditioning units. And it's no surprise that after 57, the builders started to include all the ducting necessary for central air conditioning in the homes that were being built in the Sonoran Desert. So we have all of these other factors that are coming into play: the cultural movement, the technological breakthroughs, the pensions, Social Security, private company pensions, et cetera, that come together to make those who are thinking about building, like Webb, these retirement communities, really take a hard look and come to the idea that the answer should be yes. We should move forward with Sun City. And let me just pause here a little bit on the academics of this, because there's a sociologist at the time here, and I've got a little summary, a lot of text on this image, I'm sorry, but I'll just summarize what's going on here, is that previously sociologists used to think about aging and the elderly as disengaging from their society, from how they grew up and where they worked. And then when they retire, they would just continue to disengage with the social activities of their communities, and they were preparing themselves for death in some way. But now in fact, they called it disengagement theory. Havinghurst comes in the 1960s. He says, no, that's not how it works. They should be, remain involved in regular activities and roles and social pursuits, and that will allow them to achieve optimal age, meaning they're going to live longer, for those who stay active. So this is something that comes to fruition in the 1960s. And actually, it's interesting because I've found documents in which you have Tom Breen, who works for Webb, go and actually interview Havinghurst and other academics about the new theories about aging and retirement and things. And so, and they very much look at it and they say, yes, that's what we should do. And there is a book that's quite popular at the time, William Sadler's The Third Age, this idea that of course you have your childhood, adolescence, first age, second age, of course, is your work life, and then the third age is retirement. And of course, this idea of growth and renewal after 40. And this image on the bottom left is straight from the sales brochure that I showed in the beginning of the presentation, The Philosophy of Retirement. Let me tell you, that sales brochure doesn't have a whole lot of text in it. It has lots of images, photos of Sun City being built and the amenities, the facilities that were there. But this page has like 4 paragraphs of straight, rather dense text of sort of justifying the importance of an active retirement. And that's really the key here, the notion of activity. So here is what Webb foresees, and this, of course, another aerial photograph from this is, of course, from a postcard taken in the early days of the building of Sun City. Well, it's not that early. A lot of the homes are built already. But you see that what he did is he went out and bought 20,000 acres of an old cotton farm that where the wells had essentially run dry. At least the wells were no longer sufficient to grow cotton, which, as many of you know, takes a lot of water. But the wells were still plenty sufficient for housing to supply the city, the Sun City, with it. So he does this, and he begins it in 1960 is the opening day, and I have an image of the opening day in a second here. But I want to emphasize this notion of active retirement living, because again, we hearken back to this idea that like the health seekers who were seeking to evade death and seeking health coming to Arizona, you also had Webb was selling the idea that active living was critical to evading death and healthful living. Of course, he never said the first, he never said the former, he never said, oh, come here and you won't die. But that is really the implicit message throughout it. And I wanted to, let me concentrate on this here. I actually imposed that facilities versus amenities, because Del Webb was very emphatic. Whenever any of his employees said that, well, Sun City has amenities, he would say, no. Sun City doesn't have amenities. Their facilities, the swimming pool, the croquet, the golf course, the wood shop, the bowling lawn, you name it, they were all part of the intrinsic facilities of Sun City. And so that's really the importance of active retirement living, this idea that people were going to remain active in their retirement. And as a result, the sales of Sun City, and this is from an image from opening day, January 1st, 1960, the results were fantastic, actually. News articles that I've read, journalist after journalist said, it's really the first major traffic jam in the history of Arizona was opening day of Sun City, January 1st, 1960. So many people came to see this. And of course, why was that? Well, Webb had been advertising this out in the Midwest and in the East. I mean, he was quite adept at doing that and had the wherewithal and the funds and the capital to do it. But you see the turnout, and it's not just Webb. I guess that's the larger point here as I start to conclude this talk, is that this migration had built on, really, the migration of the health seekers beginning in the late 19th century. And of course, that had its own cultural movement about moving to the West. And then, of course, the Sun City phenomenon, which I'll call it again, this idea of retiring out to the Southwest, also had its own cultural movements, social movements, economic, remember Social Security, Medicare, company pensions. So Webb was sort of in the right place at the right time with the right idea. And he had a product that was very different than Youngtown. Remember that small facility of only 700 homes. They had no facilities. They had no golf course. They had no wood shops or archery ranges or any of that. It wasn't active retirement living. And so that's where Webb really was able to bring his idea to fruition. And of course, the rest is, as we say, a history. So let me just say, though, that Sun City was not an expensive place. And even today, certainly by many standards of housing around the country, I think the average home and median price of a home in Sun City is about $260,000. Out of reach for many, perhaps, but not super expensive. But nonetheless, there were people who have migrated to Arizona and the desert Southwest and not able to settle in Sun City. However, the Sun City phenomenon, that's little s, little c, is still common. And so therefore you have these other kinds of age-restricted retirement communities. And this one, of course, is taken to the east of Apache Junction, still have, you can see the amenities, or facilities that are present in this retirement community of mobile homes, where you can see the swimming pool and the clubhouse, no doubt, that's around it, and then the little lake that's been created. The idea that we're going to create this retirement community in some way active, even if you don't have the beautiful golf courses and whatnot that Sun City did. So here we have this idea, and this is where I just want to make a couple sort of, as I promised you, some more philosophical comments here at the very end, is that the idea he's really selling, and it continues to sell not only in Arizona, but has spread. I mean, there's thousands of these Sun City type developments around the world with, and Webb actually did innovate the idea that you were going to build a golf course and then homes that open directly onto it. That hadn't been done before 1960, and it started in Arizona. But also implicit in this whole project is that you're selling youth, the fountain of youth I have here. And now you have all the folks skinny dipping in the fountain of youth, probably not happening in the Sun City pool, but you get my idea here, is that this was what is being sold, and the idea that retirement is now viewed as an object of investment, whether it be from your company pension plan and your savings and your increased wealth, but it's also now an object of consumption that is enjoyed by this newly, what I call the newly individualized self, who is going to enjoy this third age, to use the term that's been given to it by the sociologist. But death, and it is never mentioned in the sales brochures of these areas, death, once viewed as the end of a continuum of aging, which is kind of what the disengagement theory of aging that was popular until the 1960s, death is no longer viewed as the end of a continuum of aging, but it's now just a moment after the individual has lived their third age, you see. And that actually, if you think about it for very long, death has become this moment at the end of the third age. However, that predisposition towards death makes the pushing of death further and further and further away more likely. And so it has affected the use of sort of heroic measures, I think, in healthcare and in medical care, which can be tied as well. Of course, it's probably a subject for another talk sometime, but they can become tied as well to this notion of the new kinds of retirements that folks are supposed to live. Let me say parenthetically here that before I totally conclude, is that the Fountain of Youth, of course, was supposed to be, as Pizarro looked for it, in Florida. Florida, of course, was building age-restricted retirement communities before Webb was. But again, I want to remind you, they were, and if you look at the advertisements for them, and I had one earlier in the show, they were leisure places. they didn't have the active retirement things. For once, it was for some of the year, it was of course very, very humid, but also they didn't sell the fact that you were going to be super active as a retiree. It was more of a leisure approach. And that really does draw a distinction between what was going on in Florida and what Arizona became known for in its own retirement communities, following the Sun City phenomenon. So I'll end it there, and let's open it up for discussions and questions.
This is Phil Hansen. I would like to point something out. You mentioned that Bill Webb purchased 22,000 acres to build Sun City.
Oh.
I believe that he had an arrangement with Walter O. Boswell, who was a very large cotton farmer in that area, and headquartered out of big farms in California. And Bill Webb agreed to do the building if Boswell would donate the land. And obviously Walter O. Boswell Hospital in Sun City is named after him.
Yes. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
I think we have a comment in the chat from Pam. Pam, do you want to unmute yourself and make your comment live?
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to share the name of a book that I read when I was going to school at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. I'm not sure if you heard of it, called The Asylum of the Gilded Pill by Douglas Mckay.
No, I haven't. Tell us.
It's a good read. It's pretty quick, but it's a little history of the Cragmore Hall, which is used to be called the Cragmore Sanatorium. So it's on the campus of UCCS. I found it interesting while I was going to school there to read that. A little bit of a history behind the school and the community and what was going on at the time. So thought maybe if you hadn't read it, maybe it's something that you could pique your interest maybe.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
I had a question for you, Paul.
Yeah.
So kind of based on your latest book where you're looking at kind of health in Europe, I want to just say Europe in general. Do you think that that's something that Americans are lacking, especially when they get into this point of their third phase in life? And maybe it's more so now than it was historically, because I think people were generally in a little bit better shape. They were more physical, but this whole idea of having this active lifestyle when you get to a certain age to extend your life, do you think that was based on some European model? I mean, did Del Webb, was he a world traveler? I mean, was he observant in seeing that, you know, people were in pretty good shape elsewhere and maybe not so much in America?
You know, that's an interesting question. There's no evidence of that, that he had traveled and was importing, how shall we say, European ideas. Certainly they would have been Western European ideas if they had been existent. There were some sanatoriums built by the Swiss and Germans, of course, in the upper Midwest and in Canada, but I don't know that he would have looked to Europe, actually. That's not what I'm seeing in this case. And so I appreciate the question about the Europe. What I do see, and let me bring in the Beyond Medicine, which is this forthcoming book, is that the Swedes actually, because I have a chapter on Sweden and looking at aging in the United States and Sweden, which is is the comparison of the really the last chapter of the book. And really the Swedes, there is a Sun City type of community actually in Sweden. However, the big difference is that it's not age restricted. because the Swedes believe that it's better to have a mixture, intergenerational living, and they're relying actually on pretty good epidemiological research that shows that intergenerational living can lead to more bridging activities between generations and between families and between individuals is more helpful. So in any case, that there is only the one example that I can give from Sweden if you want to bring in Europe here.
Anybody else have any other questions? You can chime in or put your comments in the chat.
Hi, this is Barb.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi. I just wanted to comment a little bit about what Phil said between Boswell and the Webb partnership. And Boswell did not donate the land to Webb. They actually became a partner in the late 50s. Webb was 51% partner. Boswell was 49% partner in that relationship. And that agreement was done with J.G. Boswell, not Walter O. Walter O. was actually his favorite uncle, and that's why the hospital was named Walter O. Boswell Memorial Hospital. And that was the request through J.G. Boswell, who also purchased the hospital. So I just wanted to make that little clarification, and that the Boswells were not pig farmers, but they were cotton farmers in California and Georgia.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jill, I have a question.
You bet.
Yeah.
I've read that Sun City was segregated. Have you heard of that? Is that true?
How is it Sunday? Yeah, this really, yeah, I can make comments about that. This is I did the little shout out to Burke's article at the outset there because she really documents that very well. And I figured since I was making a presentation to the Historical Society, and that's your journal, I didn't want to repeat her article, but absolutely. I mean, this Tom Breen, whom I mentioned before, who was a sort of a first lieutenant for Del Webb in the sales force, he was very clear to his salespeople in the late 1950s and 1960s to say to any African-American potential buyers to make it very clear to them that they would be miserable in Sun City, that it was a Caucasian thing to do. That was the line that was given to potential buyers who were not white. And that included the growing Hispanic population in Arizona as well. I mean, Maricopa County now is 30% Hispanic. Sun City is a fraction of that, a very small fraction of that to this day. So there was a segregation that was going on at the same time, of course, and it's widely known now, a lot of historical work done on redlining and where realtors would only sell to certain people and others not throughout the country. So
was that also made clear to the white buyers that it might have been an appealing thing as the country was fighting for civil rights?
Oh, for sure. That same line. That's why it was their favorite line, because it worked both ways. They would tell the blacks it's a Caucasian thing. In other words, you know, and then they would also say the same thing to potential white buyers who might have been concerned or showed any concern about it. Definitely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, also, you know, when you think about it, maybe all of these types of retirement communities that had this focus on health, it wasn't just a physical health, but perhaps a mental health, kind of like come to our town and you can be safe, you know, from all of, you know, she in her article, I just lost her thing, but in the Journal of Arizona History talks about how the people in Sun City especially they tried to be as apolitical as possible, but then there was this part where they were still political because there were these things that were encroaching on their they're basically like their mental health, like the noise that was coming from Luke Air Force Base, and the was it the cattle or the animal farm that was spewing noxious fumes onto the neighborhood, and so if you think about all that, it's not just the physical health, but it's like people were kind of like, I don't know, they were like taking a deep breath saying, I don't have to worry about any of this stuff. I came from Chicago, or I came from St. Louis, and where crime was out of hand. And in my opinion, crime had to do with people of color. There's that kind of angle to it as well.
For sure. And then the one that you didn't mention, which I also write about, is the school disputes.
Oh, yeah.
It was very much a concern especially in the early days at Sun City, because Webb allowed an air conditioning technician, his family could live in Sun City, the idea. And of course, that seemed like a very, sort of practical idea at the time, as well as a primary care doc. So the primary care physician, but they both had kids. And so therefore a school bus would come into Sun City every day. And that particular visit, that school bus, actually, there were street protests against the school bus when it came into Sun City in the early days. And that, of course, quickly those families figured we're out. And so that was the attraction of it was and as Webb said in his brochures, oftentimes you do what you want when you want. You don't have to worry about, and this was implied, performing for younger people. And so that was the sort of the gestalt of the whole thing. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. And of course, the Burke article is excellent on this, but I just wanted to emphasize the comparison and the importance, I think, of the health seeker migration that preceded it as really a progenitor of sorts.
Would you mind citing your source on the African-American segregation? Because I've never heard of that before. Could you tell me where I could find more of that?
Yeah, sure. Well, the name that comes to mind, and I can't remember the first name, there's somebody, again, a sociologist named Trolander, Trolander, and I can't remember the name of her article, and I think she did a book as well, but that would be a really good source. But also I would send you straight to the Journal of Arizona History, because Trolander is what I used when I was writing my book and my article. But go to Flannery Burke. And Jill, I don't know if you have the title of the article in front of you and the journal. Is it the winter edition of the JAH?
It is. It's the autumn winter 2020, and I believe it's the latest publication for the Journal of Arizona History. If you're interested in that, if you become a member of the Arizona Historical Society, you automatically get the journal. So that was like a no-brainer plug for membership, right? But and another way to find it, it's
on Muse.
Help me out here. Yeah, but not everybody can access Project Muse or access the latest journal articles, right, Sasha?
Yeah, I can put my email in the chat, and if you want to get in touch with me, we can figure out how to get you a copy.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, or I could send you a PDF of the
article.
article.
It's a fantastic article. It really is. I mean, she's a very engaging writer, and she really kind of brings a lot of this out, and it's very, very well cited. So if you have any questions on why she would say that Sun City was segregated, there's no debate about it.
Okay.
Her article is very complimentary with mine, the talk that I just gave. So if you, great. Like I said, email me. I'm easy to find online.
Okay,
and,
thank you.
Jen Mary says, is the other author Judith Trolander?
Yeah, that's it. Judith Trolander. That's the name.
Okay.
That's
Thanks, Jen. She's one of our archivists. So.
Yay! Wow, that's cool. Whoa!
Those archivists.
Real-time fact checking. Wow. I'm impressed.
Nothing goes by them. We have another interested party PDF.
Yeah,
version
I'll
of the
I'll
article.
talk to our publications person and see if we can do a PDF somehow, and we'll send everyone the recording of this. So
Yeah.
I'll put what I find in there.
Mhm.
Have to get permission for that, and it might have a small fee associated. I have to talk to them.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anybody? I want to thank you so much, Dr. Dutton, for spending your Wednesday evening with us.
Oh,
Sorry, I'm a little
Yeah.
slow on the unmute button.
Yeah, you bet. Go ahead.
Hey, Paul, thank you, by the way, and thank you to the Arizona Historical Society for putting this talk out there. I've always wanted to know the history around Sun City. I've learned a little bit about it from just living here for 29 years in the West Valley. So
Mhm.
learned a little bit there. Learn about the gentleman who created Maryville. Very interesting work.
Oh, yeah.
He kind of did along the lines similar thing, but for younger people, I reckon. But you mentioned all the sanatoriums, and I was recently learning about the Bethany Home Sanatorium. Do you know anything about that one?
No, I don't. Where is it?
It was about 15th Avenue and Bethany Home. It was about 5 miles north of downtown at the time, I guess, or somewhere in the neighborhood of the outskirts of Phoenix.
Yep.
But that's where the Bethany Home, Bethany is mentioned in the Bible as a place where poor people went.
Yep.
And the Bethany Home was a sanatorium for poor people to go, and it had meals and it had a living quarters and all kinds of things like that. It's pretty interesting, actually.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And then of course I bet you there were 2 or 3 dozen sanatoriums in Phoenix, even before, this is in the 20s. And so I hadn't heard of Bethany before, but many of them, of course, began as charitable organizations. John C. Lincoln was a great electric manufacturer, and he became involved in that, created the John C. Lincoln Hospital, first as a sanatorium and then of course as a hospital. So many of them, as in the story, just as you described, began as charitable organizations, because very few people could afford places like the Desert Sanatorium or other sanatoriums that, they didn't take health insurance. And even if there had been health insurance of the day, they probably wouldn't have taken it. These were boutique type places. So that was why it was so important to have these charitable organizations like the one you mentioned.
Yes, it's fascinating history of Arizona. When I first moved here, people told me Arizona didn't have a history, and I said, "What?" And so I just started. You just got to dig, and you can find it all.
What's interesting is that if you go into any group, and we might even be able to do it now with the group that's here. We got a couple dozen people, and I know I did this among my colleagues at the university. How many of you had a family member who came to Arizona, some family member, whether direct or more extended, to improve their health? And you always get a hand of some sort, and sometimes more than one. So it was a very important part of Arizona history, and that's why I tie it to Sun City, because I think it's an important part of that story.
Absolutely. Again, thank you very much for taking the time to do this, and thank you to the Arizona Historical Society. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah.
And Barb, thank you for chiming in the chat. She says, Sun City history, visit our museum. We would love to visit your museum. I think Sasha has been trying to get into your museum and has never had any luck, because, we all know how that works when you don't have a full staff, and you can only be open when you can be open. And now with, the environment that it is now.
Yeah, I've been wanting to come. I just was never in town on the right day.
So could you tell us when you're open, Barb? If you're still there?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
This is Phil Hansen. I'd like to make one more comment about Sun City. Sun City does have their own museum, and it's found in one of the original model homes there in 1960 when it was first opened. Very interesting place to really learn in-depth history about Sun City.
Mhm.
Yeah, if we just extended our hours, but because of COVID, we have been restricted to do reservations only, but you're welcome to go on our website or call our phone number. And I don't have it handy right now because I have you guys up on my screen. But if you go to our website, you can find the phone number or go online and you can book a reservation. We're keeping it 4 people max per reservation. This is just because of COVID restrictions, but we are open. We just open now 7 days a week. We have been open 4 days a week from 10 to 3, but we just started, the board approved to open 7 days a week now from 10 to 3. So you're more than welcome to come. We would love to have you. The first part of the museum is made up like the model home that was shown in your opening days. You won't miss the house because it's pink and it's right by the Oakmont Rec Center, 10801 on Oakmont Drive in Sun City. So basically Grand and 107th Avenue. Would love to have you and would love to share our history with all of you. We also have research facilities on our website, and you're welcome to visit that as well. So
Thanks, Barb. Sounds
Thank
like a
you.
field trip, Sasha.
Yeah.
sounds great. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Oh, and someone had asked Shannon what the picture from our advertising was, and that pool is, I believe it's now called Mountain View Rec Center, and at the time it was called Town Hall, if anyone was wondering.
Mhm.
It was actually called Town South, because Town Hall was out actually Fairway Rec Center. It's named now, so that was Town Hall South, and that was Mountain View. So
Thank you.
would appreciate citing our sources that I see you got our homeowners bulletin off of the website and the opening day and some other pictures. Would really appreciate you guys citing our sources as we own
Mhm.
those pictures. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Well, if no one else has any other questions or comments, then we'll say good night to everyone. And thank you all for attending. This was fantastic, Dr. Dutton. Really appreciate you taking time out. So,
Very welcome. It was a lot of fun. Thank you. Good to be here.
all right.
Bye.
Okay, we'll see ya.